Good morning. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the DePaul Innovation Day, an opportunity for DePaul faculty and staff to connect across disciplines, to share expertise and collaborate for the future. We hope that you'll find the meeting informative and helpful in the following ways and more: sharing ideas and best practices for innovations and collaborations, learning about new initiatives, and community building. The 2021 DePaul Innovation Day is focused on featuring 3 academic growth and innovation fund projects, 3 University Research Council, Public Service Council, and Quality of Instruction Council projects, and 2 panel conversations on leveraging partnerships across disciplines and the teacher-scholar model. I would like to acknowledge that all of these innovation initiatives have received strong support from the university leadership. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Esteban, DePaul President, to give the opening remarks at our event. Dr. Esteban?
Thank you, Daniela. I appreciate the invitation to join you today, and I'm grateful to the Office of Academic Events and the Office of Research Services for organizing the second annual Innovation Day at DePaul. Growing up, in addition to being a lifelong Trekkie, I read a lot of science fiction. I particularly enjoyed reading Isaac Asimov. His stories transported me to other worlds and galaxies light years away. They provided that creative spark and raised the big questions. Who are we? What does it mean to be human? What is life? Are we alone in the universe? Those questions let your imagination run wild. In addition to being a prolific writer of science fiction and popular science, Isaac Asimov was a professor of biochemistry at Boston University. In 1959, he temporarily joined a group of scientists at an MIT spin-off company that had just received a government contract to elicit the most creative approaches possible for a ballistic missile defense system. The government asked the scientists to think out of the box. Asimov briefly joined this group of scientists. Eventually, he parted ways because he said having access to any secret classified information would limit his freedom of expression. His brief time with the scientists, however, made him think about the creative process, the nature of creative people, and the kind of environment that promotes creativity. He asked, how do people get new ideas? He posed this question in an essay called On Creativity. It was never published and read only by the scientists in the MIT spin-off group. That is, until 55 years later, when one of those scientists rediscovered the essay as he was cleaning out some old office files. With permission from the Asimov estate, the MIT Technology Review published the essay in 2014, and its key takeaways are still relevant today. First, the creative process doesn't follow one defined formula. Asimov said, the method of generation is never clear even to the generators themselves. Second, creative people are not only well-versed in their fields, but also have the ability to make connections between concepts that, at first, seem unrelated. Making those connections requires daring and self-assurance. While a creative person may be eccentric and unconventional, Asimov advised, to be a crackpot is not, however, enough in itself. Third, while isolation may help individuals sort through their ideas, coming together as a group to discuss, decipher, and debate is important. These types of sessions should be informal and relaxed. Quite simply, they should be fun. According to Asimov, that's how you encourage a willingness to be involved in the folly of creativeness. Today, I encourage you to embrace the folly of creativeness. Think about your own creative process. How do you develop ideas? Throughout today's programs, you will hear from colleagues who have experienced that exact process. They had the spark of an idea and they had to figure out how to act on it. I hope the innovative spirit shared by our community inspires you to turn your own ideas into action. This past year has only reinforced how far innovation and creativity can go and how much they are needed. We witness our faculty not only transform the way they teach, but also contribute directly to local and national community needs in response to COVID 19. While the ongoing global pandemic and social unrest continue to challenge us, we can begin to see a glimmer of hope as we plan for our students to return to the classroom in the fall. I'm confident you, our students, our faculty, and staff will continue to show our students the way to wisdom because here at DePaul, we embrace a culture of creativity and innovation. Here, we support scholarly and creative work. Here, we listen to each other. And here, we do. Thank you for your dedication to DePaul and our students. Please enjoy Innovation Day.
Thank you, Dr. Esteban, for your strong and inspirational opening remarks as we start the second Innovation Day. In the same spirit of hearing from our leaders that will take us on the path to transformation and innovation, it is with great pleasure to introduce our Provost, Dr. Ghanem, to present her vision on innovation, setting the tone for 2021. Dr. Ghanem?
Thank you, Daniela. Good morning, everybody. What a fantastic way to start 2021 with a focus on the great work that takes place at DePaul. A lot has happened since our first Innovation Day in 2020. And I remarked in last year's event that Innovation Day gives us a little time to reflect on the academic enterprise and to pause from the hectic grind of every day. Who would have thought that that hectic grind would go into overdrive as it did since last March? How did we do it? How do we continue to do it? The answer is because we care about our students. Victoria, if you could put the slides up. So nothing could have been more evident that we are all here for our students, as how we saw how we navigated and continue to navigate the pandemic. Your support of our students for all that you did in the last few months and for all that you continue to do. But despite the challenges that we faced last year, you still continue to do great work. I'm not sure what's going on with the slides. It's not showing up. Victoria, if they cannot show up, that's fine. I can go without it. Let me know.
My apologies, Salma. My screen share seems to be frozen. We'll work on that and get them up as soon as possible.
Don't worry about it. I can go ahead and continue without slides. I'll figure it out. Thank you. So just to give you some idea of the great work that has taken place, in terms of external funding, we had over 125 projects funded last year for close to $12 million. We also never stopped with our internal funding, and we were able to fund 95 URC, QIC, and PSC awards, 146 undergraduate research assistantships, and 20 new academic growth and innovation programs, which included, by the way, several COVID-related research projects. The total for the internal funding was close to 1.5 million. And I really look forward to hearing from the recipients of the Academic Growth and Innovation Fund on the research they did, whether it's on young adults and how they're coping with the pandemic, how they use virtual reality in the classroom, and how they're working on a certificate in theatrical intimacy. Last year, we also formed new partnerships with Sinai and the Illinois Science and Technology Coalition. In addition, we launched the Research and Innovation Leadership Fellows Program. So for the fellows, I would like to welcome our two inaugural fellows, Marty Martin from the College of Business and Catherine Ibata. Okay, forget about the slides, just ignore them now. And Catherine Ibata Ahrens from the College of Liberal and Social Sciences, who are our inaugural fellows. While we're doing welcomes, I also would like to introduce you to and welcome Lauren Miller, who joined us a few weeks ago to serve as Director of Research and Innovation in the Office of Research Services. I would also recommend that you check out the annual report produced by the Office of Research Services, which is online, and also to watch for the new research website, which will be launched this winter. And of course, a special thank you to all of you that made today possible, with a special shout out to Daniela Raiku, Marty Martin, Maya Renko, Betty Shanahan, Melissa Grady, Lauren Miller, Victoria Seamack, and Nancy Gonzalez. Whether face-to-face or in this format, such an event requires a tremendous amount of coordination and planning. So please accept my deepest gratitude for all the work that takes place behind the scenes. And a special thank you to our presenters and our attendees. I look forward to spending the day with you, celebrating the great work that is being done at DePaul. Hopefully, today will continue to spark your imagination and encourage you to pursue your ideas. Thank you for setting the tone for 2021 with this event. Where 2020 seemed to be all about COVID, let's make 2021 the year of creativity and innovation. So let's get started.
Thank you, Dr. Ghanem, for sharing your vision for innovation and empowering our students with the best possible education. We'll now start with the AGIF project presentations, with the first session being moderated by Dr. Marty Martin, Professor, Depauw College of Business and Research and Innovation Leadership Faculty Fellow.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And for our first session, I'm going to present all three of our presenters first. So we'll begin with Dr. Leonard Jason, who's Professor of Psychology in the College of Science and Health, followed by Dr. Bree McEwen, who's in the College of Communication, and last but not least, Christina Flutie, who's an assistant professor in the theater school. The way the session will work is each one of them will have 15 minutes to present. And then after they have their 15-minute presentation, then we'll open it up for questions and answers. And if you will notice at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a little Q&A icon. So feel free to kind of type in your questions there. So that's the way the session will run. I'd like to begin with Dr. Leonard Jason, who will kick us off for our second Innovation Day. Are you ready, Dr. Jason?
Yes. Thank you for the Academic Growth and Innovation Fund and at the leadership at DePaul University for helping make this study possible. This study is titled Prospective Study of Young Adults During COVID-19 Epidemic. As many of you know, there have been many past epidemics that have had consequences of post-viral fatigue. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the Spanish flu of 1918. It was caused by H1N1, and it affected about 1 out of 3 people in the world, with about 25 to 50 million people dying. And about 20% of the survivors did not fully recover. And fatigue was one of the most common long-term consequences of that epidemic. But it wasn't the only epidemic. Epidemics have gone on for centuries. Another one that you probably are familiar with is Ebola virus, and that was in 2013. It turns out that about 28% experienced unusual levels of fatigue post the Ebola virus. And actually, severe fatigue was also accompanied by muscle and joint pain and other symptoms. So the most recent COVID epidemic has sometimes been considered maybe caused by a cytokine storm. And Mayton and some others have suggested this, that there might be some hyperinflammation, which is associated with complications such as multi-organ failures. These cytokine expressions have also been implicated in the development of something I've been very interested in for many years. It's called chronic fatigue syndrome. We often refer to it as ME/CFS. ME stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis. So the illness that's called ME/CFS, we'll just refer to it that because the other name is a little bit long, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. You know, it affects about 1.5 million people in the United States. And symptoms include fatigue, which is, again, like the long haulers, people who have not recovered by COVID-19, and unrefreshing sleep and post-exertional malaise, cognitive problems. These are the classic symptoms of what's called chronic fatigue syndrome. And we think it's often triggered by a viral infection. And our group at DePaul has been studying this for the past 30 years. So as an example of the work we've been doing, we examined the relationship between mono, which is caused by a virus, and the development of this thing called ME/CFS. In one of our studies, we looked at about 300 adolescents after they developed infectious mononucleosis. And what we found in that study was that about 13% at 6 months had not recovered. And at 12 months, it was 7%, and at 24 months, it was 4%. And what we found was that baseline days spent in bed, in other words, how serious you had the infection, predicted the development of ME/CFS, not things like sort of stress or depression or anxiety, which often has been thought of as maybe causing some of these illnesses, but this study suggested it's not. It's really a biological cause for what's going on with this illness called ME/CFS. So is it possible that COVID might be a new trigger for ME/CFS? There's some anecdotal evidence about this. So some who have been recovering from COVID-19 are developing ME/CFS-like symptoms. And you've probably read about those things in papers and maybe even talked to people with them. And as you can see on the right, fatigue is the major post-viral symptom of COVID. Shortness of breath, joint pain, chest pain, cough, loss of smell. So there's a lot of symptoms, but fatigue is right at the top of the list, which is interesting for those people who might have interest in understanding this thing called ME/CFS. So our first study was really looking at COVID long haulers, those people who had not recovered from COVID versus those who had ME/CFS. And we collected data on adults and children who have not recovered from COVID. And what we found interesting is that the long haulers evidenced significantly less severe symptoms than those with ME/CFS, except in orthostatic domain. And what is orthostatic means is like if you stand up and get dizzy. Those are the types of symptoms in that domain. Very interesting. That's one of our first preliminary studies. And just to let you know, we've been using something called the DePaul Symptom Questionnaire. For 10 years, we've been developing this questionnaire. It's reliable, it's valid. Many other groups have been using it. It's been translated into many languages, and it's being used in not just the US, but Canada, Mexico, Asia, the Middle East, Great Britain, about 6 countries in Europe. And an earlier version was actually piloted in Nigeria by one of our graduate students from Nigeria. So in a sense, what we're particularly interested in this study that we're going to be talking about is, can we get data before an illness occurs? Can we find out some of the characteristics of people prior to basically a trigger, whether it's COVID or ME/CFS? And that's what we've been studying since 2013, initially with the $3 million grant from NIH. And we were studying the development of ME/CFS following infectious mononucleosis in college students. we wanted to identify variables that are potential risk factors contributing to development and maintenance of ME/CFS. And the lessons we learned from this study are very applicable for COVID-19. So real specifically, this is our study from 2014 to 2018. We have about 4,500 healthy college students who gave us blood samples, filled out questionnaires, and we followed them. And 5% developed mono. It turns out that 6 months after getting mono, 8% had severe symptoms that did not get better. So we call them the ME/CFS group. And right now, we basically have that study that just got published in Clinical Infectious Diseases. And the press release for that study came out this morning. So it's very fortuitous. Our next paper that we're working on is actually looking at immune markers of the group that went on to develop ME/CFS severe following mono to see if there's some predisposing irregularities in the immune response. So you're seeing actually for the first time these things called cytokines, they're proteins. And the red ones are basically pro-inflammatory and the blue ones are anti-inflammatory. And generally, if you look on the left side, you can see these proteins or cytokines that are in different groups. And that's the way a normal cytokine pattern looks. That's healthy. On the right side, you're looking at people who went on after a trigger of mono caused by the Epstein-Barr virus to basically have ME/CFS. So we have now cytokine protein data before they got ill. And what you can look at is that those proteins are all meshed together. They're interconnected. They're hyperinflated. There are too many connections between them. They're not differentiated into those who are anti and those that are pro-inflammatory. So that we can now begin to identify individuals by their patterns of cytokines before they get a trigger. So that might help us in all types of ways, not just with ME/CFS, but also for COVID-19. So right now we're involved in a 6-year follow-up of this large sample of 4,500 students. We got another large grant, about $2.5 million. And what we've been doing is comparing the baseline data, behavioral and immune, from 6 years ago to our current study. So because we were able to get funding from the Academic Innovation Fund, we shifted our data collection so that we could start looking at what about COVID-19 as we were recontacting students. So we're in the process of recontacting, interviewing participants on whom we already have baseline data, and we'll be able to compare the biological and behavioral data of young adults' experience prior to and during the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's just a couple of quick updates. We basically, because of our funding from the Academic Innovation Fund, we found that 5% of our sample had been infected with the virus causing COVID. We will be able to compare our findings between those who become ill with COVID-19 and those who did not become ill with COVID-19, and those who recovered and those who don't recover. We'll be able to identify predisposing characteristics, because remember, we have stored blood samples and behavioral data from years ago on these individuals we're currently studying. So our data will come from ethnically, sociodemographically diverse group of young adults and allow us to longitudinally follow up those youth over time using measures that will enable us to better understand the risk factors for the incidence of COVID-19. Now, that pilot money that we got from DePaul was used to secure a recent grant that just came in December for $282,000. And what we're now going to be able to do with this extra money from the feds and NIH is to assess those predisposing behavioral and cytokine networks. So we'll be able to actually begin to analyze the blood samples of these new individuals, pre-illness serum and plasma. In other words, to try to identify biological markers of COVID-19 in a demographically diverse set of young adults, just as we have been doing with our other study of mono. Now, what are some future directions? We need to examine comorbidities and risks that might compromise immune function, including obesity, diabetes, old age, and just a variety of things that could ultimately be implicated. And this will help us better understand those predisposing factors in the development of COVID-19 and maintenance of symptoms. And they might lay the groundwork for better understanding post-infectious outcomes in a variety of illnesses. Now, some recent news, which is very exciting, is that Congress, because literally many grassroots groups, including our group that provided data for this cause, has basically had Congress tell NIH with a bill to study COVID and long haulers. And the long haulers are the folks who have not recovered from COVID-19. This has tremendous implications that for the first time, there's going to be a tremendous amount of funds available to actually study the types of things I'm interested in, which is kind of unexplained illnesses like ME/CFS, as well as long hauler COVID, which we still don't understand why some individuals seem to get over it and some don't. But we think there's incredible implications for this work, for us understanding many of these more complex, difficult diseases. And I don't know if you know it, but going into a physician's office, about 25% of people have fatigue or pain that's unexplained. Most back pain is unexplained. So if we can basically understand some of these unexplained illnesses, we can have a tremendous benefit to medicine and to our society. So in closing, I wanted to acknowledge some of the co-investigators. First thing, Jacob First from the College of Computing and Digital Media at DePaul University, for his work in the analysis of our cytokine immune data, and particularly for some pretty complex statistical analyses. Also for helping us analyze the cytokine data, Matthew Sorensen, who is formerly from the nursing department at DePaul, and he is still continues to work with us. And we also want to extend our thanks to funding sources who have allowed us to do this important work. And they include the COVID-19 Academic Innovation Fund at DePaul and NIH, including NINS and NIAID. And I also might want to mention that this is a collaboration with Lurie Children's Hospital. And Dr. Ben Katz is a physician there who sees the patients. He does the biological work, physical exams. We basically do the psychological work of symptoms as well as psychological issues. So we really have a nice collaboration that's going on. And with that, I want to, again, thank you all for listening to this presentation. And I'm excited about trying to answer some of your questions. And I hope I've given you a glimpse of some of the work that we've been able to do. And again, thank you to the leadership at DePaul for making this possible.
Thank you so much. So I'm taking a check here to look at any questions. So please go into the Q&A section. That's the place where you can ask your questions. But I want to kind of kick off, Dr. Jason, is kind of in thinking about susceptibility to ME/CFS. Are you finding that there may be some common predisposing factors for a specific virus, or does one, if you will, have a constellation of predisposing factors that makes them susceptible for, CE, MFS after any virus, whether it's mono, whether it's COVID?
So one of the nice things, if you can say is anything nice about COVID-19, is that it's a specific insult, it's a specific trigger. So something happened. And when you talk to people, and I have people calling me every day, asking me about what they can do and what they can do for diagnostics as well as treatment, is that they were well functioning. They were doing well, and then something happened and their life has changed. And a lot of people say, well, gee, it must be they're depressed or they're anxious or there's something wrong with them psychologically. But it's not true. These people want to get back to their life. They just want to get back to being a family member, to being able to work. So they're not in bed all the time or housebound. So the reality is we want to understand what's going on with these people. Now, the problem with ME/CFS, which I've been studying, as you know, for many decades, is that there's multiple triggers. We have one that we think causes maybe about 70% of cases of ME/CFS, but in 30% of the cases, it's probably 100 different things. So it's harder to know that trigger, but it's still important for us to understand these unexplained illnesses because, as I said, over 1 million people have it. And with the COVID-19 affecting over 20 million people, it's probable that there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people who are not going to basically get well. So our lessons that we have learned from ME/CFS for decades is going to be incredibly helpful to understanding these individuals who are not getting well from COVID-19.
Yes. And if you kind of imagine, let's take it to the future. Let's imagine you get to the point where we're able to map out with some validity what those biological markers are, what those psychosocial markers are. Do you think perhaps you could have a screening tool, whether that's psychometrically based tool or genetically or bio-based tool, such that you could screen people, maybe intervene such that they don't develop the ME/CFS?
Well, I think that would be extremely important. We're actually working on that now, with our immune markers. By the way, when you look at specific like proteins or cytokines that are like pro or anti-inflammatory, like interleukin 13, it's hard to look at one little marker because in a sense, it's really how they're connected with other networks. That's what system science is about. It's not looking at individuals, it's looking at the host community with the individuals. And we are now trying to basically come up with models that are predictors of saying, if you have these characteristics of behavioral factors, and by the way, one of the behavioral factors that seems to be most promising is gastrointestinal problems, things like stomach aches. And why is the gastrointestinal system so important for people before they have this trigger? Because in the gastrointestinal system, you've got incredible amount of things going on that are connected with the brain. So it's really fascinating. If you look at the immune markers and you look at some of these gastrointestinal markers, which is what we're doing now, we're developing formulas to make predictions of what happens later. But truthfully, in the entire world, there's nobody that has this data set. And we have coalitions of people coming to us, asking to work with us from around the world, because they're so interested in what we're able to do at DePaul in really being at the forefront in this particular area. So yes, we would very much like to kind of ultimately have that type of formula. And we're actually working on papers actually right now with Jacob First Help on trying to understand how we can come up with that system. So yes.
And it's good to hear that DePaul is kind of on the leading edge of this work, both in terms of basic research and applied research. So kind of a question that I want to talk about is, to what degree is ME/CFS comorbid with maybe irritable bowel syndrome or irritable bowel disease? Because you referenced about the gut.
So it's very interesting that many people with ME/CFS do have gastrointestinal problems. And some of the more recent case definitions have them included. So yes, we do think that these things are significant, and when it's coming out of our formulas that actually we're working on yesterday, it's pretty interesting. But the most important thing that we're doing at DePaul, and by the way, we are known for our ME/CFS research around the world, and we are considered a basically important group because we have a point of view here. We're basically data-based, as the president said. We basically follow dictates of science. And what our research has suggested is the myth that ME/CFS is a yuppie flu disease is absolutely wrong. And our research has been able to show basically that we're talking about a debilitating illness that affects many people of different ethnic groups, and those of lower socioeconomic status are actually our higher likelihood of getting that illness. So we have an important thing to bust the myths. For example, if you have depression, people say, well, that's just the reason that you have ME/CFS. And I've had COVID-19 people contact me and say they're being blamed having depression for not getting well by their primary care physicians. Well, here's the thing that's important to recognize. If you're depressed and you ask them, what would you do tomorrow if you weren't depressed? they'd say they don't know. If you ask someone with COVID-19 long hauler, if you ask someone with ME/CFS, what would you do tomorrow if you were better? They give you a list of 10 things. So there's anhedonia, there's self-reproach. That's part of depression. It's not part of these syndromes. So if we can bust that myth that we're really talking about a biological illness, don't blame the person, blame the disease, then we've done a tremendous service. And we've been known for that particular position by literally thousands of people around the world who appreciate our perspective, which is trying to bust a myth that basically stigmatizes patients for having this illness.
Yes. And Dr. Jason, I'd like to thank you not only for your research work, but also it sounds as if too kind of contributing to the health and well-being of what you said are hundreds of thousands of people that may have long hauler syndrome, and for destigmatizing this, as you said, don't blame the person, maybe blame the biology, but you also focused on social determinants. So with that, I'm sorry that we're out of time. So thank you so much, Dr. Jason. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Bree McEwen. And she's from the College of Communication, and she's going to present her work with regard to AGIF.
Thank you. Let me share my screen real quick. Thank you for that introduction. I am in the College of Communication, and I'm a co-director for the Virtual Augmented Reality Communication Lab. And you can see already there our VARC mascot. He's a mascot, not a logo. And so I was invited to be a part of this lab by my colleague, Paul Booth, who when the innovation funds were announced, Paul called me up or emailed me and said, hey, you want to put together a VR AR lab and see what we might do with that. And Paul and I we're both in the College of Communication, but we have sort of divergent interests in what we might do with VR. I'm really interested in technology and interpersonal relationships, how we can look at social interaction in VR spaces. Paul is very interested in media, pop culture. He runs a huge pop culture conference here when we can meet here for conferences, and was interested in how fan communities might interact in virtual spaces. But we thought together, perhaps we could put together an experience lab, which would be bringing in different kinds of VR equipment and AR equipment to allow the DePaul community to experience virtual reality in classes, professors, perhaps broadening it out to the Chicago community. And we had gotten started on this. We had gotten awarded the grant. Our first year, we said was going to be all researching other labs. There aren't many in the country, but we visited the Verve lab at University of Georgia. We brought in Allison Eden from Michigan State at Charisma to tell us about how they ran their labs, what they did, what mistakes were made, et cetera. Part of the reason that Paul invited me onto this project was for the past 4 years or so, I had been teaching a Discover Chicago class called Augmented Chicago. And of course, like all the Discover classes, the idea is for students to experience Chicago. Ours is through the specific lens of augmented reality. And this is actually the first slide for my students every year, but I like it because you can see some Pokemon there, right? We do experience games around the city, but also if you look down towards the bridges, that is where one of the best AR experiences in the city is. And so my class in the past has looked sort of like this. What can we see here? We've got the Eastland disaster, which is on the river there, where you go and the Chicago History Museum has an AR experience set up. We've got some Pokemon going on. We've got the DuSable Museum, which has an excellent AR exhibit with the Harold Washington exhibit. And so over time, we've built this class to help students experience Chicago, but also provide an entry point to our liberal art education, where we look at social movements that use AR. We begin debating contested definitions like place, like reality, like what social means. We consider digital divides, and all this is great. And I love teaching this class. And then this happened, which we just talked about a lot in the last presentation. But this created two separate problems on the lab side and also the class side. So on the lab side, Paul and I had started, we had purchased a couple of Quest headsets. We had gone into some classes to help students experience VR. In this case, it was an advertising class where the students were creating a brief that VR advertising could be a part of it, but so many of them hadn't ever been in a virtual reality headset that I brought the headsets to class, and we experienced a social thing and we played some games just so they could get a feel for it, which was where we were building the lab towards. We also had, you know, when we had Allison in, we had the headsets so people could experience VR coming to the talk. And we had planned for last winter quarter finals week to have a VR event at the library and one on the Loop campus of like a stress reliever night to have students experience VR, play games, and just, you know, a little stress from finals. And then we realized, because of coronavirus, as everything was starting to shut down and we were all having those sort of panicked meetings of how are we even going to deliver our classes, that there was no way in that week we could do the kind of thing where we take a headset, put it on one person, and then put it on another person. There are cleaning options, but like we didn't even know what was going on with coronavirus exactly. And so that seemed very unsafe. And when we went to cancel our event, our dean was like, oh, thank God, yes, you have to cancel. So we were sort of like, okay, what do we do now with the idea of the lab and bringing people into a space to experience something? And on the flip side, on my Discover class, as Discover was scrambling and the Discover office was great in getting, you know, a lot of meetings together, have people talk about ideas and bounce things back and forth, I kept getting the message of like, but Brie, you'll be fine because you're so used to using technology in your class that I'm sure you have lots of ideas for the rest of us. And I was like, problem is, with augmented reality, it is very place-based. You have to be at the river to make that work. You have to be in the DePaul Museum to make that experience work. There are some things we could do in different places, but the idea of AR is being in a specific spot and having a tech overlay on the world. So I didn't really know what I was going to do with my Discover class either. And if you talk to my staff pro, Talisa Robinson Davis, she'll tell you, normally I have all of our immersion week stuff set in June, like no further beyond that. I don't want to be messing around over the summer with different events and what's going to happen. And even meeting early July, I was like, we'll figure it out. Something will happen. And at one point in a meeting, I said, you know, we do augmented reality. This could be virtual reality, but they don't all have headsets, and we can't ask the students to buy an expensive headset, you know, coming into DePaul. I was like, I wish I could just send them all headsets. And Talisa said, yeah, too bad you don't have a grant. And I went, but I do have a grant. And that's where we started to really put together, okay, let's take these two broken things and put them together, and if we can make a really cool experience for the students. So we did. Paul and I agreed that instead of buying a lot of different things, we would buy one headset type. We settled on the Vive Focus for a bunch of reasons I can talk about in Q&A, but have a lot to do with tech specs and some other things. And it also comes with a Vive Sync classroom, which is in beta. But we were able to do the class. We did partially on Zoom getting started. Then I sent headsets to all of the students. We had to ship about 7 of them. The rest of them, the students were in the Chicago area. So I drove all around Chicago and delivered headsets, which was actually very fun because I got to meet the students, masked, of course, like here's your headset, I'm walking away. I got to meet some parents. I got to see all their DePaul flags that Student Affairs had sent them as their first year thing. They all have them out of their houses. They're excited. And but then we got to also meet in virtual reality. And so we started having classes in this VR space and experiencing what that would look like. So for this class, a lot of things we did were taking the idea of, could you have the things you do normally in a class in a VR space, but then also talking about the affordances of virtual reality. So here you see a picture that Talisa took. That is my avatar. Lecturing to the students. And you can also see like how they're all over the country because their little times are there. We did some group interactions, right? This is a different version of the Vive Sync classroom. This is all the students and their avatars, and they are having, it's a little bit of they're in groups. It's a little bit hard to see, and they're sort of having a little drawing competition. You can see where they're drawing in space there. We watched videos, which I know we could also do on Zoom, but we came together in an auditorium, watched a movie on virtual reality here as well. We were able to bring in guest speakers. This is Matt Wren's avatar from VR AR Chicago, and because we had an extra headset, I was able to just take Matt a headset, and he set up his avatar and popped in and did a whole guest lecture on what VR AR Chicago does, which is something I normally do with the Discover class, have them meet with Matt at some point. And so here we have that same kind of interaction. And the nice thing about being in a beta setting, something that HTC was still working on, is that their product designers became very interested in how we were using the space. They actually built us, well, they applied our logo to a previous space. They were very excited about this. And I was like, but that's San Francisco in the background. And so can I have Chicago? We don't have Chicago yet, but maybe. And the students were able to interact with them as well and tell them what worked about the space as a learning environment, what didn't work, and also talk about what kind of career you could have in VR as well. Because a lot of the students that take my Discover class are CDM majors or communication and technology majors who are interested in going on to this. So the students also, I asked them a lot about their experiences in this class. So certainly I have my course evaluations, but they also wrote a short essay about their experiences in the space. We did a lot of Q&A. What is it like to be here? What does it feel like? Now, they're 18-year-olds. And so at first they were like, here are all the things wrong with this space, why it's not face-to-face. And I was like, did you guys not like this at all? And they're like, oh no, we love it. So then we got to some of the things that I'm like, okay, so what did you really enjoy about it? So some of it was that ability to interact in a different way that wasn't Zoom where we have to stare at everyone's faces. This group of students has never had a face-to-face class at DePaul. They have finished their high school on Zoom. They have started DePaul on Zoom. And so they're not comparing to the face-to-face college experience. They only know Zoom. So I enjoyed having the ability to interact with my classmates in a way that replicated a classroom setting a little closer. This was an advantage to being in this honors Discover class. This was a student who had signed up for a different one that either was too full or didn't make, and he ended up in my class and he was like, oh, I'm glad I came to this one. I prefer having class this way because I'm forced to actually pay attention. And then he went on to talk about how in Zoom, you can have your phone and be like, or a second screen, but in the VR class, you're in the headset. And so you can't be on other devices at the same time. So there's that attention aspect. I really enjoyed the clarity and the world around me. It was nice to see people in person without having to worry about social distancing. I can be close to them. I can see their avatars. I thought virtual reality was interesting. It was fun to have class somewhere else, even with the challenges, because we had to work out some Wi-Fi issues. And I love this one. Meeting in virtual reality wasn't a word. Weird. It was weird. Weird in a good way. But you can move around the room. You can raise your hand. We could sit in the auditorium and listen to the lecture. We could have a discussion. It seemed more personal, which is something I'm really interested in studying on this in general, is the idea of social presence, which goes back to Short, Williams, and Christie in the 70s. And so I'm interested in this idea of what feels more present and in different ways. Is Zoom present because we can see each other? Does this feel present because it's the avatars, even though your avatar, you can see when the avatar is talking, but it can't really express emotion very well. You have to use emojis for that. But do you still have that feeling of like, okay, we're all together because we're all in this virtual space at the same time? And then my favorite comment came out in class, and I think the administration might like this one as well. One thing I really liked was telling my friends who decided to go to Loyola was that my professor at DePaul sent us all VR headsets, which is very handy because the idea of the grant, even though we haven't fulfilled it in the way that we thought we might, was to build experiences at DePaul that you wouldn't have at other universities. So even though this is a little, rivalry kind of thing, I think it does speak to, we were able to do that. And we built a student experience for this particular section that was unique, different, interesting, something you wouldn't get anywhere else, which I feel fulfills the mission of the Discover Chicago class. The other point of our lab was to help with, both retention and recruitment, because that was an aspect of the innovation lab. We're still or the innovation grant, we're still sort of working on that. But we've gotten some press with Vive because HTC was so interested in what we were doing. They used us as a case study for one of their own blogs that got picked up by XR Today. So DePaul's kind of out there in the VR, XR, this is just sort of VR and AR together, in the sort of XR community being talked about as like, oh, here's a place that's doing something very interesting with virtual reality. We are also working on a newsroom story with Kristen Matthews. She's got the story all together. It's just every time we're like, yes, we'll do it. We'll pitch it. Like the first time was that week of the election day that happened. And then, December was December. And then we were ready to pitch it again, and everything that was going on at the Capitol was happening. So now we're hoping things will calm down a little bit and we'll be able to get that story into the news cycle in a way that will, again, put us on the map in the Chicago community and perhaps beyond that, of a place that's doing things that are really interesting and innovative with teaching. So I would like to thank you for your time and your attention today. The lab is an evolving project. We do have these 27 headsets. We got them all back from the students, which I was worried about. I'm planning to teach my graduate seminar in spring quarter with the headsets as well. And we're looking at other projects, but we are also happy to think about experiences for other folks, collaborations, because this lab was intended to be a community experience. And so we're still looking for ways to make that happen. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that the audience members may have a number of questions in thinking about a course that they may be developing for the spring or the summer, or a course for the winter. So let me ask this question first. You mentioned you're going to do a similar course for graduate students. And so do you think it'll make a difference how 18-year-olds may respond to this versus 25, 30, even 35-year-olds?
That is an empirical question.
Okay, right.
Right? We will find out. I don't know. So this group of Discover students is very interesting because they're always, the students who sign up for Augmented Chicago are very invested in tech. They want to go on to be designers, to be in animation, to do games, etc. But yet, even in this group, only one of them had ever been in a VR headset before. So this was a whole new experience to them. With the graduate students, we're gonna have to think about how we do it, because what we've realized is that you can only really be in the headset for about an hour, and then you start to kind of, it gets heavy, right? It's on your face.
Yep.
And then you start to kind of be like, I don't like this, I can feel like my physical self not enjoying this experience anymore. The graduates, with pandemic, we needed to be a little more lecture style. The graduates will be able to you can put a virtual table here, sit around the table and have more of a conversation. And we'll see how that goes. So I'm hoping for a more kind of seminar feel, like you would get in a seminar class. The concern, one of the issues is it also becomes very difficult to take notes in settings. So we're gonna have to really think about how do we remember what we are doing in the VR space. So it will probably be a blend.
Yes. Yep. So it may be a little bit of Zoom, a little bit of VR, and then when we go back to face-to-face, a little bit of face-to-face. So
yeah.
Yep. So I want to ask this question. Maybe I feel like I shouldn't ask it, but I'm going to ask it. How much do they cost?
So purchasing was actually a huge issue because we decided early July, Lisa had that like spark moment of, oh, if we had a grant, and I was like, oh, grant. Yeah. And then Paul and I decided, yes, this is what we were going to do. And we were originally thinking quests. You could not buy 25 quests for love or money at that time. Now we know why, because they were in production for Quest 2. They just hadn't announced it yet. But then at the same time, Facebook said that you were going to have a Facebook account to use the Quest product, which we are not okay with, requiring our students to have a Facebook account. So we had to go back and forth with a lot of different companies. The Quest would have been cheaper, right? A Quest 1 was running about $400, and we spent about $750 on the Vive plus a warranty, because they promised us that if they got broken in shipping or something, that
Yes.
the warranty would cover it, which was a big deal for us.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we spent about $25,000.
Right, yeah, right. And I'd imagine, like any technology, kind of the prices go down over time, and then kind of new iterations and versions come out. So I'm curious, so for faculty members that are not well versed in VR and augmented reality, what would be the learning curve for any faculty members that may want to try this out for the fall, in terms of navigating the software and learning how to use this technology?
So there are different kinds of VR spaces, and I think they do have different learning curves. And it's really going to depend on how much experience you have with kind of like the back end of your computer. You don't need to have a ton of experience with VR. You put on the headset, it walks you through the setup process. There's only 2 buttons on the controller. You can figure that out pretty easily. The trickier part for this kind of classroom was being able to set up a meeting, but now we're also used to setting up Zoom meetings. It's a very similar kind of thing where you schedule it in the calendar. And then being able to get files into the system and out of the system. But that, you know, once you figured it out, like the picture behind me is the classroom, right? That's actually a PDF, not a PowerPoint. So it was like weird things like that are very simple tech kinds of things that you wouldn't think being an issue. But once you could figure that out, this is also a web browser. So if you're in the headset, like the video I ran was just me going to YouTube and playing the video through the headset.
Yes.
So those things are not very difficult. There's also other spaces, and I know other aspects of DePaul have been kind of looking into this, like Virbella, which is you have an avatar and you're in that kind of physical space that you don't need a headset for. So those are possibilities as well. And I think with each one, you just kind of like playing with the program a little bit and getting used to it. I don't think the learning curve for using the software, for using the hardware of the headset is very difficult. What gets tricky is that the different spaces have different technical issues. Like in Virbella, you can have sound locked off when you move into a space, and you can only hear the other avatars who are in that space. You can't do that in the Vive Sync classroom. So I couldn't, we had to like really figure out, okay, we got to mute, and now we can talk, and now we can mute, and now we can talk. So those things are worth playing with for a little bit to kind of figure out what's happening.
And I'm reflecting on kind of all of our experiences as faculty and even staff with COVID-19, is that probably prior to COVID-19, if you were to tell people you'll be teaching on Zoom, a lot of them would say no way in the world. But in fact, it is happening. So the final question before we wrap up is, 10 years from now, do you think that this particular technology will still be novel as applied to classrooms and colleges, or will it be more commonplace 10 years from now?
You know, so in the VR world, the joke is always, oh, everything's 5 years out, but it's been 5 yefor 30 years, right? I think we're getting really close, and we're getting to this, you know, I didn't have to pay $2,000 for a headset, right? The technology is becoming more common. It is going to become more common that people will just have a headset in their house, right? Especially
like a computer.
Like a computer. And I think it will become more common that colleges can say, okay, if you're going to do this distance learning and you're going to do it in this, you know, we offer these VR classes, like you would expect a student to buy a laptop, you could say you can buy a headset, right? That wouldn't have been appropriate this year at all. But in the future, yes. And I think as some of the technical issues get worked out, like being able to see what people's faces are doing is going to be one. There's a lot of great work going on with how hands move in space as well. Getting that sound issue is so simple. It just needs to be coded into the space. Getting that sound issue worked out, like this will be an option that can feel a little bit more like a face-to-face classroom than a Zoom. You know, we were experiencing a kind of a different kind of fatigue with having the headset on, but as those get lighter, that'll be easier as well. But you don't have that feeling of like Zoom fatigue where your brain is trying to concentrate on all these faces at the same time, because you're just in the classroom, like you might be. And so I think that it will become one of the modes of education as we move forward. The other nice thing you can do that we didn't do a lot with this particular class, but the HTC designers came and demoed for us, is you can do a lot of 3D models. So they brought in a brain that they would use in like a psychology class, and you can turn the brain around and you can walk right up to it and you can point to it and say, okay, what's this, what's that? You can slice it. And so those kinds of things for classes in the sciences, in design, architecture.
Bringing things to life. I'd like to thank you so much. And again, another example of how DePaul is on the leading edge. So thank you not only for your presentation about the technology, but also a strategic partnership that you developed as well. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Christina Flutie from the theater school, and she's going to present her AGIF grant in slightly different.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Marty. I'm so happy to be here, so honored to represent this project. I've been working with Amanda Pulcini and Jason Beck. We've made a great team so far. This is a level 1 funding, so thank you again to AGIF for this opportunity. I wanted to start off with we're going to just be talking a little bit today about what this is, what is intimacy direction, what is intimacy coordination, tell you a little bit about what we've been doing research-wise, and then also talk a little bit, very fledgling ideas, about what our program might look like. I do have a content warning here. I will be saying the word sex, so get ready for that. And I wanted to lay some groundwork because I know that a lot of folks don't really know what this is. So starting with first and foremost, what is intimacy? This is a very new field, and we consider in the theatrical setting that intimacy can be multi-layered, complex, and we include a lot of different relationships as we are considering, would this production need support from an intimacy professional? So that could be not just the scenes that are simulated sex, but also, you know, if I'm an actor playing a mother and I'm pulling an actor playing a child onto my lap, then we might want to be very mindful about how we handle that moment. And of course, if anything is violent or non-consensual, then we want to make sure that we're taking some extra care. This is a definition that Amanda, our project assistant, has been developing in some of her training that she's been doing. And as you can see, it includes simply the notion of being vulnerable with each other, which actors do in most of the work. As we move the field forward, we want to be respecting even more that actors need support, more than what they've received in the past. They need more consideration and respect when they're asked to be doing this difficult material. And hopefully, we are quickly moving past the old versions of just kind of pushing through the difficult material. So you've heard me say intimacy, direction, and coordination. I just wanted to be sure and explain what that distinction is. First of all, these are the people who are brought in to oversee scenes that involve any kind of intimacy, especially if there's nudity involved, violence, etc. The people who are working in theater, the title has evolved to be the intimacy director. And for those working in film and TV, the title has evolved to be intimacy coordinator. So those titles are actually not interchangeable. And you know, these professionals, they're becoming, we're finding that they're becoming more and more valuable as we see how they change the rooms that they're in. Their primary responsibility is to make sure that actors are not harmed physically, mentally, emotionally. And they're really working to address the power dynamics that are in the room. Sometimes they have to work strategically in them. Sometimes they're actually dismantling them. That's always ideal. but they provide this bridge between the actor and the director. So if a director wants to communicate about the intimacy and doesn't quite know how to do it in respectful ways, the intimacy director can sort of translate, liaise between the actor and the director. If the actor has concerns that they don't feel comfortable going to the director to, again, power dynamics, then the intimacy director can bring that to the director and hopefully provide a communication that works. And of course, logistically, it is the job of the intimacy director or coordinator to make sure that the scenes that they're choreographing look real, right, while it's actually safe for the actors. So I wanted to give just a little brief history of the field. As I said, it's new, and you can see in this little timeline that there's a big jump from what we consider to be the inception of when we first started talking about this to now, to when we first started actually training in this field. Tonya Sina is credited with sort of starting everything off when she was in grad school at Virginia Commonwealth University. And basically she was saying we need to give just as much attention and care to these intimate scenes as we do for combat, right? Because we don't actually slap each other or stab each other on stage, right? So why are we coming into these intimate moments and saying, well, just kiss, just do it, right? So unfortunately, you may or may not know, but there was a time when that was the case. So fast forward 10 years after lots of her work throughout mostly academia and a little bit in the professional field, she was getting a lot of pushback. It took her about 10 years before she had more sort of buy-in and momentum, and she founded Intimacy Directors International with a couple of colleagues. It was also around this time, you might remember, that there was a huge expose in the Reader about a now defunct theater company here in Chicago called Profiles. Their artistic director was, it came out that he had numerous sexual abuse, sexual harassment allegations against him. And this kind of kicked off a lot of other theater companies with having allegations against people involved. So people were starting to come forward and say, we're not going to tolerate this kind of treatment anymore. And then you will definitely remember that the Me Too movement started. We started hearing from people in Hollywood and other fields. And I always like to note that Me Too, the hashtag Me Too, and that first outcry actually was started in 2006 by Tarana Burke, an African-American woman who's an activist around these issues. So again, as time went on in Chicago, we saw another huge development. Some non-equity theater companies came together to create an organization called Not in Our House, where you can go for support, you can go for advocacy if you need it. Basically, Equity is our theater union and a bit of an overseeing organization. There are many theater companies who do not belong to that union or who do not operate within those protocols. So, you know, I think there are maybe 700, 800 theater companies in Chicago alone, and many of them are non-equity. So this was revolutionary in our local professional community. And the other thing that happened is they started to create, and now this document exists, continues to evolve, the Chicago Theater Standards, which lay out safer protocols for actors. And now you can be trained, quote unquote, in this field of intimacy direction or coordination by a few different organizations, and I'll talk about those. But it's very, very, very new. It's really just been in the last 3 or 4 years that it's become more common for intimacy directors to be on productions. Now at TTS, the theater school, prior to, I've been there since 2015, and it's my understanding that prior to that, and in my time there too, Usually the professors are choreographing intimacy in our productions. Usually it's the movement professors like me. Sometimes it's sort of dovetailing with the choreographed violence. And also in 2015, we created our process for rehearsing and performing intimate contact. It's a document that lays out the protocols and how to move through the processes, and how to also where to go if you have a concern. When Sue Fenty-Studham came in 2017, she was also developing stage management protocols around intimacy. So that was also starting to sort of codify a little bit of our process and procedure. And we also began, as they became more educated, we started to hire in intimacy professionals from the field when I couldn't do it, or Patrice couldn't do it, or whoever was usually tasked with choreographing intimacy. If it was a big production that needed a lot more support, we started hiring people. But we're still kind of missing, both in the field and in the school, frankly, what I might call a shared vocabulary and agreed upon landscape for how we're upholding a culture of consent and honoring boundaries. And we've been working on this. We're all working very hard. But I really felt that we needed more grounded ways to move forward. So that's when I said, gosh, kind of like Bree was saying, like, I need a grant. There's so many things where I might be sitting in my house thinking, I need a grant about, but this one felt really important. And so I went to Jason Beck and I said, what if we had a certificate, a training program at the theater school where we were training intimacy professionals? So we decided that we would research, we got the grant, and we would research all the existing training programs. We wanted to travel and see them. We weren't able to do that, obviously, with COVID-19. We consulted with so many different experts in different sort of facets of the field. We've been participating in some trainings ourselves because we realized very quickly that that was the way to learn about what kind of a program we would want. And then we've started to put together some ideas. There have been some benefits to this sort of pivot to online. We think that maybe we've gotten a little more online training than what we would have gotten in person. So we've been able to talk to a lot more people, and we have been able to pay many artists for their consultation, which has also been a nice benefit. Currently, there are a few companies around the world. This is the list of the ones in the United States. There are also training hubs in the UK, Canada, Australia, and also most recently New Zealand. We've been working with and hope to partner with this one at the top, intimacy directors and coordinators. We have found their pedagogy, their methodologies, their codification of things to be quite superior, and we want their expertise in our school. So currently, if you want to be trained as an intimacy professional, there are all kinds of different ways to do it, and there's no standard yet in the field. We think that probably eventually one day there will be, perhaps Equity or the other unions in film and TV will start to develop some overseeing guidelines. You can do anything from a weekend workshop that's a Saturday morning to the whole weekend. You can have a weekly class. You can contact someone and be apprenticed. And we, like I said, we've been taking advantage of those opportunities, and we've been excited about it. But there's still this sort of gatekeeping that's happening with mostly with the expense. It's very expensive to do this training, and so underrepresented communities, BIPOC students, disabled students, often they're not able to access this training, and we think that DePaul could be a real hub. So as we started the year in 2020, which it quickly all, was sadly decimated, but there were about 30 theaters in Chicago who were employing intimacy directors. And there are currently 8 what we might call certified by one of those companies intimacy directors here. So you can see that's a big gap. and the demand is going to rise. And then in film, it's even more. People, it's hard to get onto a film set. So right now, there are currently no certificate programs at the university level that we know of, and they will crop up. We know they will, and we want to be a leader in this field, and we want to do it right. We want to serve the students. We want to serve the field. The students are making more demands about what they need, and we want to meet those demands. And it will create a better community for everyone. So again, our program is still in process, but we are looking at possibly a 2-year program with different tiers that would probably, you know, the student number would go down as the certification level went up as we were moving into one-on-one mentorship. Right now, it can cost up to about $15,000 for someone to get trained in this, and we really think that we can do better. And we know that many of our students will also be wanting to get the certification. They're already asking us. So we hope to research more thoroughly. We hope to begin to develop what a program would really look like. And we're going to apply for the phase 2 of the funding. So thank you so much. I'm ready to answer questions. I wanted to also leave you with, for just a little bit of time here, this what is called the pillars. You can kind of read through that. This is considered to be the sort of fundamental underpinnings of what this work needs as you are moving into working with intimate material. So thank you.
All righty, so I think it's now time for any questions or responses that you might have to this very fascinating project with regard to kind of bringing on intimacy directors within the theater as well as film. So Christine, as I'm checking here for the questions, I'll ask one while people are thinking about and asking their questions, is if I'm understanding correctly, is intimacy is about making sure there's some safe boundaries, but also on the other side about vulnerability. So is that correct or not correct?
It is correct, definitely. And, you know, there are both sort of logistical and sort of well-being considerations woven into that, right? And you can't really tease them out from each other. So logistically, right, an intimacy director is going to be the person who facilitates the process between the actors and with directors around, you know, where are you okay with? Where do you feel confident with me touching you today? Right? Just very simply. Before we make this choreography, tell me where I can move, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the broader side, the intimacy director is providing support for the actors and really anyone in the room who may need support around, especially if it's difficult material. Mm-hmm. One of the last tenets here you'll see is closure, and that's a big job for the intimacy director to make sure that the actors are not taking the work home with them. So I'm not going to go home believing that I love my scene partner because it's acting.
So what's fascinating for me is, again, kind of DePaul on the leading edge, that we're the first university-based program to really launch this, whereas others are primarily sponsored by societies and associations. So I'm wondering, as you envision rolling this out, would this be credit bearing or non-credit bearing or both?
We're thinking that it would be a graduate level certificate, so it would be credit bearing. Mm-hmm. We haven't worked out all of the details. We have drafted many different models, but definitely credit bearing. We would hope that people would be eligible for financial aid. That would help with the expense.
And definitely, if it's credit bearing, then that would help the expense and also address maybe some of the access issues that you mentioned.
Yes.
So I was surprised by just the number in Chicago, and you said it's growing. So any sense of nationally, how many intimacy directors?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Here's the thing, it's kind of a wild west out there. There's no, like I said, there's no overseeing organization. So yes. Some people are saying, I'm certified with intimacy directors and coordinators. Other people are saying, I've done all this training and I'm qualified to do this work. When I started doing this work, I didn't have any certifications. And because there's no requirement, it's really just based on word of mouth recommendation. So it's hard to say. There are probably the people who've gone through the IDC's programs. There are maybe 50 at the very, very most.
Okay, yeah. And so the certification is granted by the IDC or another body?
They are the only organization so far who are calling their training certification.
Okay.
And there's no one overseeing, must you have a certification to do this work?
So a question from the
I predict
audience.
it will come.
So I'm wondering what qualifications might serve this role best, acting experience or another experience?
Oh, that's a great question. Certainly, if you have acting experience, you know what it's like to be there in that role, doing those movements, et cetera, doing that choreography, but also a background in movement, a background in movement analysis, a background in stage violence. So a lot of people who are choreographing combat are foraying into this area. But I have found also my skills, I have a master's degree in dance movement therapy and counseling, and I've brought in all of those skills, as you might imagine. And we do with intimacy directors and coordinators, they train in mental health first aid and anti-racism practices. And the training that these professionals receive is quite broad and also deep, so that they can really facilitate mindful processes.
And I could definitely hear a little bit about the therapeutic process, particularly when you talked about closure. And another question from our audience. So do you also work with music instructors as well, particularly as regard to teaching private lessons? Because there may be things in terms of, piano instruction or violin instruction. So you may be getting close to a psychological boundary or a physical boundary.
That's such a great question. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's doing this work or training in this work, we believe that everyone needs to be educated on what it means to honor, to have a consent-based practice and to honor people's personal boundaries, both psychological and physical. So that's part of our vision for the program, is that some of that level one, that tier one training could be open to the university, could be open to the public, it could be a revenue generator, because this is really just good citizenship.
So for that tier one, I'm just wondering, when you think about try to engage students at the high school level or college or graduate school level, particularly in courses where it could threaten people to some degree, would that kind of initial training be valuable for faculty members as well?
My short answer is yes.
Okay, yeah. And I think that if faculty are equipped with that, they may be more likely to actually do it, but also looking at themselves rather than just looking at the students alone. So I want to thank you so much, Christina, but I think we have another question that came in. And
okay.
So are actors open to having this kind of conversation, or are some resistant and they just want to do it without taking it all the way through? So do they believe that this type of training limits their creativity and artistry?
It's such a great question. It's one of the biggest questions. Many people are very resistant to having someone come in to tell them how to move through these processes. In fact, I don't think she would mind me saying this. Our project assistant was one of those people. She was on a very big production, or Astaia, at the theater school, and an intimacy director came in, and she was like, I know how to do this. Just let me do it. I'm fine. We trust each other. Everything is great. And now she wants to be an intimacy director. So usually people, they just need to see that. In fact, one of the things that I love to say is the possibility of being able to say no really actually opens up a lot more yes.
Yes. And it's respectful, and also make sure that people are safe in the way that they define it, maybe not the way the other person defines it.
Absolutely, that's key.
So Christina, I want you to stay on, and I would like Dr. McEwen and Dr. Jason to please join us for our kind of open panel for any questions or comments that the audience might have for the next 5 minutes. So I'm kind of taking a look at the Q&A there. So let me kind of pose a question as I kind of monitor the Q&A. So any insights or recommendations about faculty members that might think about applying for AGIF funding? So what advice or recommendations or insight might you have for them?
So what I would say briefly is that, the Vincentian mission is really research, kind of teaching and service. And I think the three presentations all had that, which is kind of great. So to the extent that we are Vincentian and we're really kind of putting those three things together, I think ultimately our proposals are going to have a better reception. And by the way, just to mention, everything we've been talking about has something to do with psychology. And I think that collaborations between different types of groups is so important. You know, I was thinking about just the last presentation, you know, we're talking about the actors, kind of, what about the audience? How do they feel? And do we think about sort of the reactions they're having and how we're basically helping them go through potentially traumatic experiences? So there's so many roles and so many places that we can try to understand technologies and how they basically help or don't help the learning process. So again, fascinating stuff. Yeah, those are my.
So kind of focus on the mission, focus on what it means to be Vincentian, and kind of the theme throughout was really about well-being and health and respect. So for others, any insights or recommendations for those that may be interested in applying for AGIF funding?
So we actually took 2 rounds at it, right? So don't feel discouraged if you don't make it in your first round, because we were really able to sort of take that feedback. And I'm trying to remember what the piece was that really like made the difference. It might have just been what was in that particular round too, but it is, you know, that kind of revenue generating. So we had to make that argument. And so we are kind of hoping to go where Jason goes next. You know, we've got the retention recruitment piece that we're doing, but use this as seed money to build up to other grants as well. So you want to make sure that's in there, right? It can't just be your passion project. You do have to say kind of like what it's going to be for the DePaul community. But if you can make those connections, I think you're in better shape for getting a grant.
And you mentioned something that's a little bit different at level 3. It is about the commercialization. So it's not only having an impact on kind of individual lives and collective lives, but also kind of hit the positive financial bottom line as well.
Yeah.
So for Christina, any insights or recommendations that you might have about applying for AGIF? And then I'll pose a question from the audience after you respond.
The one thing that comes to mind for me that we actually had to flesh out in our application was to be sure that you're also including really what is existing in the world already with this idea. You know, I didn't give too much information, but it's really important that we understand the broader context of what we're proposing here at DePaul, both in Chicago, the nation, internationally, because even though, you know, someone is doing it somewhere probably, and we want to know where we fit into that.
Definitely. And I think DePaul has some unique positioning on that as the first university based. So a question for all of you that came from the audience is this. So other than maybe kind of purchasing the VR equipment, then what are some other expenditures that the AGIF funding covered for you?
So we kind of have this difference between like what we intended and what we wanted. And the budget office was very good with that, you know, because when we switched plans, we did like run it through our dean,
Yes.
run it through the provost, run it office, and then talk to the budget office about what we were doing. So this was our equipment expenditure, and we still have money in our grant that was intended for travel, which we did some of the travel to Georgia to bring in speakers. So that was one thing that we did as well to pay for that. We have money in our grant to pay for a graduate assistant, because the idea was that graduate assistant would staff the lab, right? So we haven't done that aspect of it yet, but those are all pieces that we were able to pay for with the grant funding.
Right. And for Christina and Dr. Jason, how did you kind of allocate some of the expenditures and spend the money?
We had to completely overhaul our budget after COVID because a lot of our budget was allocated towards traveling and meeting people and participating in their work, interviewing them, etc. So we reallocated funds to actually be to take their online offerings, which we feel like all of the companies really offered a lot online over the past few months, and also paying consulting fees to talk to these experts and really get more information from them, and also our program assistant as well, because I was embracing the fact that I could have help.
Great. So it sounds like it can be for equipment, it can be for software, it can be for travel, it can be for students, it can be for assistants. Any kind of unique expenditures for you, Dr. Jason?
So, you know, we had over, in the last few years, over 100 undergraduates making phone calls. Well, we had to call over 100,000 people in the Chicago area
My
to
goodness.
basically do basic epidemiology to
Yes.
find out the prevalence of ME/CFS in youth. So we have a lot of students who didn't get paid and just did volunteer work. And if anything, they signed up for independent studies. So DePaul made some money. So the fact that we now have money, we used our money to support a BARA, research assistant, so that we could pay back somebody who could get a job to get some credentials. And one of the exciting things about getting credentials, over the last 20 years at our center, we've had over 200 people get into graduate programs because they're connected with these types of research efforts. So again, it all comes together. Money helps, but it's really research, service, and teaching. Put them together, you have DePaul University.
And with that, that's a kind of a good note to leave us with. I want to thank all of the presenters for kind of your very creative and innovative sessions. And I'm sure that for the audience members that you're more inspired and energized, and maybe consider applying for an AGIF grant. And if you do, the deadline is on February 15th. So with that, let's get set for our 15-minute break and be sure to come back for the next session. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.